It begins not with fire nor with war, but with a whisper. A child lies awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling of a crumbling hab block, listening to voices that no one else can hear. They call his name, soft as lullabies, yet sharp enough to draw blood in the silence of his mind. Shadows ripple where no light falls. Objects tremble as though restless. The child shivers, knowing deep within that something is terribly wrong, yet unable to tell anyone, because in the Imperium of Man, a truth like this is a death sentence. Every Psyker's story begins in silence, but it never ends that way. It always ends in screaming. If you walk with me through this tale, through the hidden paths of the warp and the doomed souls who stumble upon them, stand with this channel. Like, share, and subscribe. Not for me, but for the lore itself. So these stories of dread and awe do not vanish into silence the way Psykers always do. It began with a flicker. At first, it was nothing more than the hab lamps stuttering when the boy grew upset, the faintest tremor in the walls when he cried. His mother dismissed it as faulty wiring, the Hive's eternal decay. But deep down, she noticed the pattern. The lights always failed when his tears came. The air grew colder when he was afraid. By the age of 6, he was already different. While other children laughed in the refuse lanes and played in the shadow of manufactoria spires, he sat apart, staring at things unseen. His eyes followed whispers no one else could hear. He spoke sometimes to corners of the room where no one stood. At night, his screams rattled the thin metal walls, for he dreamed of oceans of blood and faces that melted into shadows. His father tried to discipline him, as all fathers in the Imperium must. But when the boy flinched beneath the blow, the man's hand shattered against an unseen barrier, bone snapping clean as glass. He never raised his hand again. Instead, he watched his son with quiet terror, avoiding his gaze as though the boy's eyes had become weapons. The neighbors began to whisper. They noticed how vermin fell dead in the boy's path, their small bodies shriveled and empty. They saw doors unlock themselves when he reached for the handle, and they muttered the word every Imperial citizen dreads, the word that brings the black ships, Psyker. The mother grew pale and thin. The father drank more with each passing night. They loved their child, but love does not survive long in the Imperium when set against fear. By the boy's 8th year, they no longer spoke to him as a son. They spoke to him as a curse, and so the boy learned silence. He learned to hide the voices that whispered to him in the dark, to pretend that his dreams were normal, to act as though he were human like everyone else. But the truth pressed against the edges of his soul, demanding to be known. Because Psykers do not remain hidden forever, the secret could not last. In the Imperium, nothing ever does. It was the neighbors who spoke first. Whispers turned to reports, quiet words to a passing clerk from the administratum, a note scrawled on a data slate left at the foot of a local shrine. They claimed it was for the safety of the Hive, that the boy was dangerous, cursed, an abomination who might summon horrors from the warp. In truth, it was fear and envy that guided their tongues. Fear of what he might become, envy that the Emperor had marked him with something greater, even if it was damnation. His mother tried to deny it. She pleaded with the ecclesiarchy priest who came to their hab, swore her child was innocent, blessed, misunderstood. But when the priest demanded the boy recite the catechisms of repulsion and the litany of protection, the air around the shrine candle shivered and the flame bent away from him. The priest's face hardened. His verdict was already written. That night, his parents argued in hushed, frantic tones. His father wanted to send him away, to the lower levels, to vanish among the wastes of the Hive where the Imperium's gaze might falter. His mother clung to hope, praying that the whispers would die down, that the reports would be buried beneath the endless bureaucracy. But bureaucracy is the one god that never fails the Imperium. Within weeks, a black-sealed notice appeared on their door. The Astra Telepathica had been informed. The boy would be taken when the black ship next arrived in orbit. Terror settled in their home like ash. The boy understood little of the Imperium's endless hierarchies, but he understood the look in his parents' eyes. They no longer saw him as their son. They saw him as a death sentence. And then came betrayal. His father vanished one night, leaving nothing but the stench of recaf and cheap amasec in the air. His mother, hollow-eyed and trembling, pressed a bundle of ration tokens into his hands and whispered that he must hide, must run, must never let the priesthood take him. For if they did, he would never return. So the boy fled into the labyrinthine underhive, down into the endless dark where the manufactoria waste dripped and the glow lamps died. Yet even there, he was not free. The whispers followed. The dreams worsened, and above, high above in the spires, his name passed from scribe to scribe. ink on parchment, a tiny mark of doom that would bring the Emperor's hunters closer with each passing day. The black ships were coming. The underhive swallowed him whole. Down there, beneath the endless strata of industry and rot, the air was thick with chem smoke and the stink of decay. The lamps flickered weakly, some little more than dying sparks above rivers of sludge. Every wall was scarred with rust, every floor slick with waste. It was a place where the Imperium's gaze faltered, where law gave way to hunger, and where only the desperate and the damned endured. The boy learned quickly what it meant to be an outcast. The gang smelled weakness like carrion birds. They cornered him in the tunnels, demanding his ration tokens, mocking his pale, wide-eyed fear. But when one of them shoved him, when another raised a blade, something inside him broke loose. It was not a scream he gave them, but a surge of invisible force that hurled them against the walls like ragdolls. Their bones cracked on rusted steel, their eyes wide with terror. He fled before they rose again, heart hammering, the taste of iron in his mouth. He had not meant to kill, but part of him already knew that he had. Nights were worse. Alone, shivering in some forgotten culvert, he heard them, whispers, clearer now, pressing against the edge of his mind. Voices promising power, companionship, release from fear. Shapes swam in the darkness behind his eyelids. Creatures with too many mouths, shadows wearing his mother's face, laughter that cut deeper than any blade. He would wake gasping, nails dug into his arms, blood streaking his skin where he had clawed at himself to drown the voices out. He prayed, though he knew no litanies. He whispered to the Emperor in broken words, begging him to silence the nightmares. For a moment, sometimes there was peace, but it never lasted. The warp was patient. It only needed him to listen, and still he wandered, deeper into the veins of the hive, searching for somewhere the voices could not reach him. But there was no such place, for a rogue Psyker carries the warp inside him, whether he wills it or not. And in the darkness, something had noticed him. The silence of the void broke with a whisper of steel. High above the hive, beyond the polluted skies, the black ship descended. Vast and lightless, its hull was carved with wards that shimmered faintly against the stars, every line etched to keep what lay within from ever breaking loose. To most of the hive, it was nothing more than a distant silhouette, another passing vessel in the Emperor's endless fleet. But for those who carried whispers in their minds, its presence was a blade pressed to the throat. The boy felt it before he saw it, a crushing weight in his skull, like invisible fingers prying into his thoughts. The voices that had tormented him fell suddenly silent, retreating like vermin before fire. For the first time in months, there was peace, but it was not a gift. It was the silence before judgment. Word spread quickly through the spire. The Astra Telepathica had come, their sanctioners and wardens descending into the hive, their black-armored escorts at their side. They carried chains inscribed with runes, muzzles for the mouth and mind, and data slates heavy with names. His name was among them. He fled deeper, driven by instinct. He knew nothing of the black ships except the stories told by fearful children, of Psykers shackled in the dark, their eyes burned out, their souls fed into the golden throne until nothing remained. But instinct was enough. To be found was to vanish forever. Every corridor became a trap. The underhive echoed with the tramp of boots, the drone of vox-amplified commands. He saw others taken, thin, pale figures dragged from their hiding places, their mouths gagged with iron, their eyes glazed with terror. Some were older, broken things who stumbled willingly into their captors' arms. Others fought, but resistance was short-lived when bolters and shock mauls were at hand. He ran until his lungs burned, until every step felt like knives in his feet. The black ship was not hunting him alone, it hunted all his kind. But he knew that it would not stop until it found him. And deep inside, beneath the terror, another truth began to rise, a truth he had never dared to admit. The warp was still watching. The boy became a shadow among shadows, moving through refuse tunnels and abandoned manufactoria, where the stink of promethium masked his scent, and the noise of broken engines drowned his heartbeat. Yet the hunters came closer with every passing day. He could feel them, their minds locked like iron, voices sealed against the warp, sanctioned Psykers, leashed but potent, swept through the hive like hounds sniffing for blood. Whenever they drew near, the whispers in his head fell silent, and the silence was worse than the torment. Hunger gnawed at him. His ration tokens were gone, bartered for stale bread and rust water long ago. He scavenged what he could, gnawing bones left by the Underhive's carrion eaters, drinking from pipes that stank of rust and oil. His thin body weakened, yet his mind, his curse, grew sharper, more alive. Fear sharpened it. Desperation fed it. It was in that state he met them, a gang of Underhivers who called themselves the Ash Rats. They found him crouched in a drainage alcove, half dead, and laughed at his frailty. But when one reached to drag him out, the boy's fear lashed outward. The ganger's knife hand twisted backward, snapping like dry wood. Instead of killing him, the gang leader, an older man with augmetic eyes glowing faint blue, grinned and offered him shelter. For weeks, he stayed among them. They fed him scraps, gave him a place by their fires, and in return, he used his curse. Doors unlocked at his touch. Patrols were misled by flickering lights. Rivals fell to sudden seizures when they challenged the gang. Among the Ash Rats, he tasted a kind of belonging he had never known. Yet even here, trust was poisoned. He saw how they watched him, not with love, but with calculation, weighing his worth against the risk of harboring a Psyker. And when the black ship's sanctioners came nearer, when the gang heard whispers of bounty marks for those who delivered the cursed, they decided. He woke one night to the click of a weapon priming. The leader's augmetic eyes glowed in the dark, cold and merciless. They bound his hands, gagged his mouth, and dragged him through the tunnels toward the surface. For the first time, he saw the truth in their grins. He was never one of them. He was a tool, and tools are sold when the price is high enough. Betrayal burns colder than hunger, but the warp had not abandoned him, and betrayal has a way of opening doors better left closed. They dragged him through the tunnels like a prisoner, wrists raw from the cords, gag cutting deep into the corners of his mouth. Ahead, the surface glow seeped faintly down the shafts, pale and cold. Every step upward was a step closer to the sanctioners, to the chains, to the black ship's lightless hull. The Ash Rats moved quickly, driven by greed, muttering about the throne gelt they'd earned for his head. He listened, but not with his ears. Fear sharpened his mind until their voices seemed to echo inside him, clearer than sound. He tasted their intentions, their certainty of his fate. They would hand him over before dawn. He would never again see the filth and smoke of the Hive, only the dark of the Emperor's dungeons. Something inside him cracked. The whispers returned, stronger than before. They spoke with hunger now, curling around his thoughts like smoke. Do not go to chains. You are more than prey. You are power. You are ours. He tried to resist. He bit down on the gag, shook his head, prayed silently to the Emperor for strength. But the Emperor did not answer. The voices did, and then it happened. The boy screamed, not aloud, but within. The scream tore through the warp, and the warp screamed back. The air in the tunnel thickened, warped, bent. The Ash Rats staggered, clutching their heads as blood streamed from their noses. The leader raised his weapon, but his arm twisted backward, bones snapping, flesh tearing. The tunnel lights burst in a shower of sparks, plunging them into shadow. And in that shadow, something moved. Eyes opened where no eyes should be, glowing faintly like embers. A shape too vast for the tunnel pressed against the walls of reality, clawing to get through. The boy saw it, not with sight, but with soul. A monstrous grin of fangs, 1,000 whispering mouths promising freedom, glory, ecstasy, damnation. His scream became a roar as power poured through him, raw and unshaped, burning his veins like molten fire. The gang died in silence, their bodies torn apart without a blade ever touching them. Bones shattered, skin peeled, eyes burst. Blood ran down the walls, steaming in the sudden cold. The tunnel stank of copper and ozone. And when it was over, the boy knelt among the corpses, shaking, sobbing, his breath ragged. The whispers laughed softly, curling around him like a lover's arms. He knew then what he had become. Not cursed, not blessed, a beacon, a door half open, and the things beyond were watching. He could not stay near the bodies. Even in the Underhive, even in a place where corpses fed vermin daily, the carnage he had unleashed was too grotesque to go unnoticed. The warp's fingerprints lingered in the air, an unnatural chill, the faint echo of whispers, the stink of iron that clung to the flesh. He ran, half-starved and half-mad, stumbling through the endless dark until his lungs threatened to tear themselves apart. From that night onward, life was no longer living. It was hiding. Every sound became a threat. The shuffle of boots in the tunnels, the groan of rusted steel, the hiss of leaking steam. Each sent him scrambling deeper into the shadows. He He trusted no one. He spoke to no one. Hunger hollowed him out, yet he dared not seek food among the ash rat's rivals or the scattered shanties of the Hive's lowest. Someone would recognize him. Someone would trade him for safety or coin. Worse still were the dreams. Sleep offered no rest. When he closed his eyes, he was back in the tunnel, blood on the walls, laughter slithering through his mind. Sometimes he saw his mother's face, but her eyes burned like coals, her mouth twisting to speak words not her own. "You are not my son," the voice would croon, though it was not hers at all. Other nights, he saw the black ship itself, a great void-born coffin, its decks lined with chained Psykers whose screams never reached their lips. He woke gasping, every time, and always the whispers returned, urging, coaxing, tempting him to use the power again, to feed it, to grow. But he knew the truth now. He was no longer hunted only by the black ship. He was hunted by the warp itself. His outburst had marked him, a flare of light across the Imperium, and predators had turned their eyes upon him. Some nights, when the air grew too still, he swore he felt them pressing at the edges of reality. Shapes without form, voices without mouths, hungering for the crack in his soul. He was prey in two worlds. In one, the Emperor's hunters stalked him with iron and chains. In the other, demons circled, whispering promises of deliverance. And every day, his strength to resist grew thinner. It was only a matter of time before the Imperium found his trail again. The massacre of the ash rats had not gone unnoticed. Rumors spread through the underhive like infection. Stories of bodies twisted in impossible ways, of walls slick with blood though no blades were seen, of a child who screamed and the world itself bent to his will. These whispers carried upward, into vox lines and scribes' reports, and soon the sanctioners descended once more. They hunted him with precision. Patrols blocked the tunnels, squads of black-armored wardens scouring the darkness with Auspex devices tuned to the warp's residue. He learned to feel them before he saw them. A suffocating stillness, a dampening of the whispers, the air itself tightening around him. When they drew near, it felt as though the Emperor's shadow pressed against his chest, trying to crush the corruption out of him. The boy ran. Always he ran, through collapsed manufactoria, across rivers of sludge, past the skeletal husks of machines that had not moved in centuries. More than once, he nearly fell into their hands. A light would sweep across him, boots pounding behind, chains rattling in anticipation. He escaped only by instinct, by reaching into the well he dared not touch. Rusted gates tore themselves from their hinges to block pursuit. Steam vents burst in scalding clouds. Shadows thickened unnaturally, cloaking his steps. Each time, the whispers coiled closer, crooning praise, urging him to lean deeper into their embrace. But the cost was mounting. Every use of his power left him weaker, more hollow, more aware of the eyes that watched from beyond. He felt them when he was alone, shapes pressing against the veil, scraping at the edges of his mind. Sometimes he heard them laughing, sometimes they called his name, and sometimes he swore they guided his feet, steering him away from death so that he might live long enough to serve them. One night, he cornered himself. A collapsed tunnel blocked his way, and sanctioners closed in behind. Their vox grills rasped prayers as they raised their chains. His heart hammered. He pressed his back to the wall, knowing there was nowhere left to run. The whispers were there instantly, warm and insistent. Say the word. Open the door. Let us in. His lips trembled. His body shook. He wanted to scream for the Emperor, but the Emperor had never answered. The warp always did, and as the sanctioners drew closer, their chains glowing faintly with runes of binding, he realized the truth. This was not a chase, it was a siege. The noose was tightening, and something would break. They cornered him at last in the bones of a collapsed hab block, a place where families had once lived before fire and time stripped it bare. Ash crunched beneath his feet as he fled through hollow corridors, broken pict screens staring blankly from the walls like empty eyes. But the sanctioners were faster this time. Their voices echoed through the ruin, amplified by vox, chanting litanies of binding and purification. Every word felt like a weight pressing down upon him, crushing the air from his lungs. He stumbled into a dead end, a wall of ferrocrete where once a stairwell had stood. Behind him, boots pounded closer, chains rattling. A light swept across the ash and pinned him there, his thin frame trembling, his breath ragged. He turned, eyes wide, as the black-armored figures emerged from the dust. They were not like the gangs. They did not taunt, they did not mock. They moved with grim certainty, their faces hidden behind iron masks. One raised a staff inscribed with wards, its head glowing faintly. Another uncoiled the chain etched with runes. The boy could feel its hunger, the way it sought to drink him in, to silence the fire within. He tried to run, but the wall was unyielding. He tried to scream, but the gag of fear sealed his throat. He tried to pray, but the Emperor remained silent. And then the whispers surged. They flooded his mind in a torrent, louder than ever before. Do not beg, do not bow, take them, break them. You are not prey, you are power. Tears streaked his ash-stained face as he sank to his knees. He did not want this. He did not want the voices. But he wanted the chains even less. His lips parted, and though no sound came forth, his mind spoke the word the warp had been waiting for. Reality cracked. The walls shuddered. The air split, and something vast and unseen forced its way through. The Sanctioner's staff glowed bright as a star as he shouted words of banishment, but his voice drowned in the roar of the Imperium. Figures coiled from the shadows, not fully formed, their outlines flickering like half-remembered nightmares. Hands of fire reached from the walls. A face too large for the room pressed against the veil, laughing with mouths that were not mouths. The warded chain lashed forward, wrapping around the boy's wrist. Agony seared his flesh, burning the corruption from his skin, but it was not enough. Power surged through him, and the chain snapped like brittle glass. A shockwave hurled the Sanctioners into the rubble, their armor ringing like struck bells. The ruin fell silent. The shapes withdrew. The whispers laughed softly, satisfied, and the boy stood alone again, trembling, knowing what he had done. He had called, and something had answered. In the weeks that followed his escape, he no longer recognized the sound of his own thoughts. Where once silence had been an enemy, now it was an impossibility. The whispers never left him. They crept into every pause, every heartbeat, every corner of his mind where stillness might have lived. At first they were fragments, hissing laughter, a phrase repeated like an old hymn, a promise muttered in 100 tongues. But slowly they grew into coherence. They spoke not merely to him, but through him, threading their words into the marrow of his being. "You are chosen," they breathed, in voices softer than any lullaby, sweeter than any human comfort. "You are not refuse. You are not prey. You are power unbound." He tried to deny them. He tried to cling to memories of a childhood already broken, to the faces of neighbors long dead, to the fleeting echo of prayers he had once whispered at shrines of dust. But every denial fed the whispers, as if they thrived on resistance. At night, when he closed his eyes, he dreamt of himself robed in fire, armies prostrating themselves at his feet, the stars bending in obeisance to his will. The images terrified him. Yet when he woke, heart hammering, sweat soaking his ragged clothes, he could not shake the taste of hunger on his tongue. It was not the hunger of the body, though his ribs still ached with emptiness. It was the hunger of the soul, the thirst for the destiny those dreams dangled before him. Sometimes he thought he heard the Emperor's name among the voices, not as a rebuke, not as judgment, but as if it were another mask of power, as though the Golden Lord on his throne and the entities in the void were but two sides of the same crown, waiting for him to claim it. He recoiled at the thought, whispering apologies into the dark, but the apologies were weak. He knew it, and the voices knew it too. One evening, in a cavernous stretch of Underhive where the air tasted of rust and ash, he stood before a mirror of broken plasteel. The jagged reflection stared back, eyes ringed with shadow, lips cracked, hair falling like the filth around him. Yet beneath the weakness, he saw it, a glow, faint but undeniable, as if the warp itself clung to his flesh. The reflection's mouth moved before his own did. "You are already more than human." He staggered back, shaking, but he did not smash the mirror. He could not. Some part of him wanted to see it again, to believe it. The whispers grew bolder. They spoke of futures where his name would be written in blood across the stars. They promised him vengeance against every sanctioner, every overseer, every soul that had looked at him with disgust or fear. They promised him worship, adoration, and immortality, and though his heart recoiled, another part of him leaned closer to listen. For the first time in his cursed existence, he began to feel something like mastery. The voices no longer seemed to tear at him from every direction. Instead, They flowed together into a rhythm he could almost guide. When he concentrated, when he whispered the phrases that slipped unbidden from his lips, the air shimmered. Dust rose in swirls that danced like puppets. Rusted chains creaked without touch. A guttering lumen strip blazed suddenly, flooding a chamber with harsh light as though obeying his command. It was intoxicating. He had spent his whole life crouching, hiding, being cornered like vermin. Now, at a thought, he could make the vermin of the Underhive writhe in his grasp. Words spread quickly through the shadows, faster than he could control. Whispers of a man who could heal wounds with a touch of flame, or cause an enemy's eyes to burst from their skulls in silent agony. At first they came cautiously. Outcasts, scavengers, desperate souls with nowhere else to turn. They begged him for protection, for miracles, for vengeance. He told himself he would not answer them, that to draw such attention was to invite the gaze of the black ships once more. But when the first of them knelt, offering loyalty in exchange for survival, he found himself nodding. And when the second and the third knelt, swearing fealty in blood and whispers, he felt something stir in his chest that he had never known. Belonging. With every act of power, they adored him more. The weak brought him scraps of food, stolen laspacks, and coin gleaned from dead men's purses. The broken called him savior, a shield against the cruelty of hive life. They saw in him a figure rising from their own ranks, and for once, he began to believe it. But the corruption clung to every gesture. When he healed a wound, it did not close cleanly. Flesh knitted together with a grotesque ripple, scars twisting into unnatural patterns that pulsed faintly in the dark. When he struck down an enemy, the body writhed for moments too long, as though something unseen feasted upon the departing soul. The faithful averted their eyes at these moments, but they did not turn away. If anything, it deepened their reverence. He convinced himself he was in control, that these were just costs, like the bleeding nose of a sanctioned Psyker, or the tremors that plagued astropaths. He told himself that the warp was a tool, and he was its master. Yet in the quiet, when the followers slept, and only the echoes of dripping pipes kept him company, he knew the truth. The whispers had not lessened, they had simply changed. They spoke with his voice now, and their laughter lingered behind every thought. Still, he pressed onward. He taught his makeshift congregation the words that came unbidden to his tongue, weaving them into chants that filled their gatherings with fervor. He led them through the darkness like a prophet, a phantom cloaked in grime and fire, and though he smiled at their faith, he could not ignore the shadows that lengthened at the edges of every triumph. Each time he reached into the warp, he felt it reach back deeper into him. It happened in a moment that seemed both ordinary and eternal. A debt collector gang from the deeper sump levels had heard of his growing circle, and they came not with reverence, but with scorn. 12 men armed with stubbers and blades, their leader sneering through a vox-distorted mask, demanding tribute or blood. His followers cowered in the shadows of the rusted corridor, their faith wilting in the face of real steel. For the first time since his rise, the Psyker felt fear gnaw at him again. The same old terror of being cornered, hunted, crushed beneath greater force. But this time, the warp was already at his fingertips. He raised his hand, voice breaking as he cried out words that were not his own. The air buckled. The lumen strips burst, plunging the hiveways into red darkness. Shadows surged from the walls as though the hive itself had bled them forth. The gang's laughter cut into screams. Flesh tore without blade, ribs snapped under invisible fists. Eyes boiled into black ichor that streaked down their faces. And then came the moment that broke him. The gang leader staggered forward, his mask half melted, vox snarls breaking into wet sobs. He raised his hands in surrender, dropping his weapon. For a heartbeat, the Psyker faltered. He could have ended it there, could have turned away, left the man broken but alive. His followers would still see his power, still fear and worship him. But the whispers surged, shrieking with hunger, drowning every shred of mercy. Claim him, bind him, ours, ours, ours. He reached into the man's skull, deeper than he had ever dared before. He felt not just the body, but the soul, its fear, its desperate clinging to life, its flicker of memory and pain. And then he crushed it, not like ending a life, but like extinguishing a candle, only to feed its flame into himself. The sensation staggered him. Fire poured through his veins. He gasped, shuddering, as though every nerve was alight with ecstasy. His body swayed, his vision blurred, and when it cleared, he stood taller, stronger, The room seemed sharper, every sound clearer, every breath from his cowering flock a symphony of reverence. But behind the exaltation, something writhed. The whispers no longer needed to speak. They pulsed inside him, fused with his heartbeat, their laughter spilling out of his throat when he tried to breathe. The followers saw what he had done and fell to their knees, weeping, calling him deliverer, Messiah, chosen. They did not see the truth, that the man before them was no longer only himself, that a fragment of the warp now wore his skin, and the price of his power had been paid with his very soul. When the blood finally stilled on the floor, when the echoes of screams faded, he realized the truth. He could never go back. The Emperor would never forgive him. The black ships would never contain him. The warp had marked him, claimed him, and he had accepted its hand. The path of damnation was no longer ahead. It was beneath his feet. The days that followed his ascension by murder were a blur of fever dreams and hollow triumphs. His followers grew in number, their faces gaunt, but their eyes ablaze with devotion. They painted his sigils on the walls in blood and ash, scrawled half-formed litanies that twisted the Emperor's holy words into something darker. He let them do it. He even encouraged it, for the hunger within him swelled each time they cried his name like a prayer. But deep inside, he knew what stirred. His power was no longer his own. Each time he reached into the warp, it reached further into him. He felt its claws now, subtle but undeniable, scraping at his mind, dragging shadows across his soul. His reflection no longer matched his movements. His eyes glimmered faintly with colors not meant for mortal sight. Sometimes, when the silence lingered too long, his lips moved in whispers, not his own. And then came the hunters. The first signs were distant tremors, the vibration of heavy transports above the Hive levels, the muffled thunder of sanctioned boots. Word came from scavengers. The black ships had returned, and they were not alone. Arbite's patrols swept the hab blocks, searching, interrogating, purging. To the Psyker, it was inevitable. He had known from the moment he crushed the gang leader's soul that his path could end in only two ways: chains of black iron aboard a silent vessel, or death upon the pyre. The whispers mocked his fear. They are nothing. Burn them. Tear their minds apart. You are beyond them. Yet even as they taunted, even as they promised victory, he felt the lie in their words. He was no god. He was prey that had worn the mask of a predator for too long. Paranoia hollowed him. He saw betrayal in every glance from his flock. He punished imagined treasons with bursts of fire and agony, leaving the survivors trembling but still worshipping. The Hive that had once seemed a labyrinth of refuge now pressed against him like a tomb. Corridors echoed with phantom footsteps. Every shadow seemed to conceal the Emperor's hunters. And then, at last, the veil broke. A patrol cornered them in the depths of a manufactorum ruin. Bolters barked, lasfire seared, and his followers screamed as bodies fell around him. He tore open the warp in desperation, slaughtering sanctioners in waves of invisible force. But for each one that died, two more seemed to take their place. Their chants filled the ruin. The Emperor protects. The Emperor judges. Each word rang like a hammer upon his fractured will. He fled deeper, dragging the warp behind him like a storm, his followers dwindling with every passage. Their loyalty was fanatical, but fanatics die quickly against the Imperium's iron. And as he stumbled into the choking dark of the sump caverns, alone at last, the truth pressed down on him with merciless weight. There was no escape. His power had become his prison. His soul was already claimed. The Imperium would not forgive. The warp would not release. He was caught between gods and men, between the Emperor's silent throne and the ravenous abyss. And for the first time since his awakening, he understood what he truly was. Not a savior, not a prophet, a doomed man, walking the path every rogue Psyker must walk, toward chains, fire, or damnation without end. The sump caverns stank of oil and rot, stagnant pools reflecting the shimmer of lumen flares carried by the hunters who stalked him. Their voices carried, distorted by the dripping stone and corroded metal. Harsh commands, clipped prayers, the mechanical growl of Voxlink orders. He pressed his back against a wall slick with filth, chest heaving, blood running from his nose and ears where the warp strain gnawed at him. His hands trembled, not from fear alone, but from the weight of power coiling within, demanding release. He was cornered, and he knew it. The whispers urged him on, shrieking now, no longer coaxing but commanding, Unleash us! Tear the veil wide! Be as we made you to be. Their laughter was thunder in his skull, drowning even the sound of approaching boots. He clenched his fists, eyes burning with a light that did not belong to mortals. He swore he would not fall quietly, not dragged like some beaten wretch to the pyre or the cells of the black ships. If his end was written, then it would be written in fire. When the Arbites breached the cavern mouth, he gave himself to the warp. The air fractured. Stone cracked and shrieked as invisible claws ripped the walls apart. Bolt of fire thundered, but the rounds burst mid-flight, detonating in sickly blossoms of green flame. The Psyker's scream became a chorus, his own voice woven with dozens of others, some not human, some not of this plane. For a moment, the hunters faltered, their formation breaking as shadows writhed from the ceiling like living chains. But the warp is never gift without cost. As he unleashed the storm, he felt it claim him. His skin split, eyes blazing with unnatural fire. His body bent beneath forces not his own, limbs jerking as if pulled by unseen puppeteers. His laughter echoed with inhuman harmonies, and in the terror on the hunters' faces, he saw the truth. They no longer saw a man. They saw a rift, a wound in reality, a thing born to be purged. The Arbites advanced despite their fear, their vox voices steady, their faith unyielding. Prayers to the Emperor filled the cavern, their words cutting against the storm like blades of light. Bolters roared, flamers hissed, and each step they took forward drove agony into the Psyker's flesh. The warp screamed in fury, urging him to burn them all, to tear open the veil fully, to let something greater spill into the world. And for one fractured instant, he considered it, to surrender wholly, to let the voices within him take the last shreds of his soul and turn him into something eternal. But the Arbites pressed on. Bolts tore into his twisted flesh. Fire engulfed him. Chains of blessed steel clamped around his arms as sanctioners surged forward. He fought, but his movements grew erratic, his strength collapsing beneath the weight of his own corruption. The warp roared furious, denied its final victory. And then silence began to seep in. A silence deeper than the whispers had ever allowed. As the world faded, he caught his reflection in the oily water at his feet. What stared back was no longer human, eyes burning coals, mouth twisted in a rictus grin, skin crawling with half-formed glyphs that writhed as though alive. He did not know whether he had been captured, slain, or simply unmade. But he knew this: the fate of every rogue Psyker was the same. Damnation was not avoided, only delayed, and his delay had ended. The storm of battle ebbed, leaving only ruin in its wake. The cavern reeked of burned flesh and promethium, the walls scarred with charred glyphs that seemed to twitch even in death. The Arbites advanced cautiously, muzzles tracking the twisted figure that writhed upon the ground. Chains of null metal pinned his limbs, their runes glowing faintly, feeding on his strength. Each link seared him, cutting deeper than steel, burning not his flesh alone but the warp-scorched fabric of his very soul. Still he laughed. The sound was broken, fractured, threaded with voices not his own. His followers lay scattered in heaps of blood and bone, their prayers drowned in fire. He was alone now, except for the things inside him, clawing, desperate to escape. The Sanctioners knew it too. That was why their weapons never wavered, why their chants never ceased. They knew he was more doorway than man. In the end, his fate depended not on mercy, for there was none, but on procedure. Some whispered among themselves that the black ships would claim him, bind him in silence, drag him across the void toward Terra's pyres. Others argued he was too far gone, that to carry him was to risk contagion, corruption, a breach into the Emperor's own realm. The Psyker himself no longer knew which fate awaited him. In the haze of pain, the warp showed him visions, one where he burned alive, his screams drowned by the roar of flame as a cathedral full of zealots chanted litanies of purification. Another where he was dragged in chains into a vessel of black steel, locked in a coffin of null fields until the last ember of his soul guttered out on Terra. And a third, more terrible still, where he slipped free of his captor's grasp, his body shattering, but his essence hurled into the warp forever, a whisper among demons, neither alive nor dead but unendingly damned. Perhaps one of those visions was true, perhaps all were, perhaps none. What mattered was that his story ended as all rogue Psykers' stories do, with no redemption, no glory, no salvation, only the Emperor's judgment or the warp's eternal hunger. And in the silence after his last breath, or his last scream, or his last flicker of thought, only one certainty remained. The doom of a rogue Psyker is not chance, it is law.